So the other day, I was thinking about the phrase, the cat's pajamas. For those not lucky enough to have come across this cute little idiom, it's a now somewhat out-of-fashion way of saying something's really good. It's fantastic. It's the cat's pajamas. And then I stopped and I thought, that's a bit of a weird way to say that. I wonder if there's an interesting story that explains where this phrase comes from. Who was the iconic cat? And from where did he get his famed pajamas? So I looked into it, and wouldn't you know it, as with so many things on the internet, the answer isn't as clear as you might think. So, for a bit of fun, I thought I'd put my investigator's hat on, dive into the records, and see if I could figure out a concrete answer on who gave the feline its sleepwear. And actually, I found out some pretty interesting stuff. So come with me on a quick investigation as we solve the curious case of the cat's pajamas. Okay, so we actually have three potential suspects: the royal tailor, the comic artist, and the flapper. And we'll break these down as we get to them, but first, a little background into the case. When you look online for the origin of the cat's pajamas, you'll find that it's likely a bit of 1920s jazz-related slang, from the same school as the bee's knees and other somewhat less famous animal-related phrases like the eel's hips or the flea's eyebrows, and many, many others. This is undoubtedly a huge thing in 1920s slang. You take a random animal, say an aardvark, and something it would be comical for it to have, like an anorak, and then you've got your slang. It's not just good, it's the aardvark's anorak. One of the first printed of these that people have found is our phrase, the cat's pajamas, which has been sourced by Dave Wilton of wordorigins.org to a 1919 publication, an army hospital in Denver's newsletter that writes, well, what else could O'Brien's helpers say but he thought that it would be the cat's pajamas to have feed like that dished up to the fellows every Thursday. Dave Wilton also sources the bee's knees being used as a superlative in this 1917 cartoon from the Pennsylvania Scranton Republican. The bee's knees is definitely an older phrase than this, in the past sometimes meaning something tiny, other times meaning something exotic, but it seems it doesn't start to mean something good until the late 1910s. Of course, these are just the first found printed uses of these phrases. There could well be older uses in print that we simply haven't found yet, and obviously also these phrases would have existed in language first before being written down. I found this article in a 1921 copy of The Talking Machine World, which points out that vaudeville acts were being barred from adding the slang of the day, such as the cat's meow, hot dog, hot cat, and the cat's pajamas from their songs and shows, saying these terms had already popped up in material in the past season. That kind of shows you how these terms could have entered the public consciousness without being written down. All of that's to say, the exact timeline of which phrase came first and when is a little murky. Perhaps cat pajamas was the first and the rest followed. Perhaps it was the bee's knees. Perhaps it was the flea's eyebrows. It's hard to know for sure. But either way, that's likely the origin of the phrase. Simply, it's just nonsense. And if that's all I had found, I would have called it quits there and you would not have been watching this video, as I would not have made it. But when I dug a little deeper, I found some other possible origins of the cat's pajamas, some much more interesting ones. And that brings us to suspect number one, the royal tailor. You see, I was patronising some less scrupulous sections of the internet, places where the bouncer waves you in without even checking to see if your sources are real or fake. And I was keeping my ear to the ground looking for a lead, and I started hearing the local gossips telling an interesting story about a cat. You see, the word on the street was that a few hundred years ago, over in merry old England, apparently King George III developed a penchant for pajamas. And not just any pajamas, they had to be fit for a king, as it were. So the silky nightwear was crafted for him by a famed royal tailor named E.B. Katz. And the story became so well known by the people of the kingdom that it birthed a phrase. If something was good, it was the cat's pajamas, named after the skilled couturier and his nifty nightwear. I found this story across numerous articles and repeated confidently in Reddit replies. But as people who've watched a few of my videos might have already noticed, there's a problem here. As I heard it, this story often started with some version of the red flag phrase of another theory suggests, or the story goes, or some say. All of these set off alarm bells, as they are often the words you read just before you're delivered some unsubstantiated apocryphal story. In legal terms, It was all just hearsay. Our witnesses were all just repeating a story they'd heard from someone else. I needed to find some stronger evidence. A first-hand account, perhaps. So my first port of call was to dig into the royal line and see if the monarch and the moggy really were connected. King George III. What do we know about him? He ruled from October 25th, 1760 until his death on January 29th, 1820. Longest ruling male monarch in British history. Lost the War of Independence with America. Has the unfortunate nickname of Mad King George thanks to his mental illness that developed in later life. And, most important for our purposes, no credible reference to wearing pajamas. Bit of a dead end there. Alright then, what do we know about the supposed E.B. Katz? Well, nothing. Outside of the Katz pajama story, I couldn't find any historical reference to someone called that. Which is odd, as on the Royal Collection Trust website, I do actually find George III's financial records, specifically wardrobe accounts supplied by the tailor White and Humphreys. That's not E.B. Katz, is it? I guess the king could have more than one tailoring company in his employ, but if I'm honest, at this point, I was starting to think that the story might be a royal red herring. Alright, let's look at it another way. When did pajamas even make their way over from India to the United Kingdom? According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, they were introduced in England as lounging attire in the 17th century, but soon went out of fashion. About 1870, they reappeared in the Western world as sleeping attire for men, after returning British colonels brought back with them the pajamas worn by Hindus. When you compare these dates to the reign of King George III, it doesn't look great. Okay, so let's give this story one last bit of charity. Can we find out what rich men were likely to be wearing to bed at this time? Well, seemingly, likely, it would have been a white linen nightshirt, like the ones you see catalogued on this WordPress, georgianera.wordpress, specifically on this post, and so to bed, 18th century night attire, posted by Sarah Murden. Yeah, and as we scroll down, you can see quite a lot. Wait, that's bloody King George III, in bed, wearing what appears to be a robe over a white linen nightshirt. Not pajamas. Now, of course, this is a satirical print, but we have to ask ourselves if the pajamas were so famous at the time to have created a phrase that lived on for centuries, do we not think the artist would have depicted them? No, I'm sorry, in my opinion, this whole line of questioning is a dead end. We have to rule out our first suspect, E.B. Katz, the tailor. So then, to suspect number 2. The comic artist. You see, there was another name going around. Thomas Aloysius Dorgan, or Tad, as most people know him. Tad had an accident as a child that took off all but his thumb on his right hand. Undeterred, he learnt to draw a second time, this time with his left hand. And he was bloody good at it too. Eventually, in 1905, aged 28, he combined his love of drawing and sport, especially boxing, when he was employed at the New York Journal as a sports writer and cartoonist. Over the next couple of decades, he kept outputting work in various widely published strips, such as the Judge Rummy comic, which later became Silk Hat Harry's divorce suit, and the single-panelled indoor sports, as well as the occasional outdoor sports. These were incredibly popular, and Tad became a well-known name across the States. And perhaps the most interesting thing about his career, and certainly the most relevant to our case, is the thing that Tad's work most became well known for was its marvellous use of slang. In fact, Tad would sling so much slang into his strips that when he sadly passed away at the age of 52, his obituaries praised him for his invention of words as much as his funny drawings. And on many places on the internet, including Wikipedia, we see the claim that he came up with or popularised many terms such as dumbbell, a stupid person, for crying out loud, an exclamation of astonishment, hard-boiled, tough and unsentimental, and of course, the cat's meow and the cat's pajamas. Superlatives. And you also sometimes see the bee's knees attributed to him. Well, Tad, it's quite a curriculum vitae you've got there. But from where is the internet pulling this information? Well, one particular obituary seems to be the culprit, written by W.L. Werner, who is a professor at Pennsylvania State College. On Tad's death, he wrote in the academic journal American Speech, quote, "Among the terms which the daily press credits Mr. Dorgan with inventing are," and then we see this huge list of slang terms, and bang, right there, we have the cat's pajamas. So you might be thinking, well, there you have it. It's now confirmed who authored the phrase. But not so fast. W.L. Werner is not exactly saying that. He writes that that's just what the Daily Press is saying. Werner could have said something like, Tad invented the following words. But he doesn't do that, which does seem to be a purposeful step by the professor to not solidly state that this is a fact. So how can we prove one way or another whether Tad invented our phrase? My first stop was to check the archive. Luckily, there's quite a lot of Tad's work on the Heritage Auction website. Obviously, with the amount of work he put out after years of doing comics, it's just a tiny fraction of his back catalogue we find online. But still, there's a fair bit there, so I went through all of it, and here's what I found. First, yes, I can definitely see that Tad liked his slang. There's a lot of it, to the point where some of it is sort of unintelligible now for me to read as someone who doesn't know what all the slang means. But secondly, I found no reference to the cat's pajamas, or his other supposed famous feline phrase, the cat's meow. I did find quite a few references to cats, for example, these women referring to themselves as cats. But no reference to the cat's pajamas. That of course doesn't prove anything either way, but that's my report on what was/wasn't there. Interestingly though, I did find a spider's eyebrows, which does fit the bee's knees, heels, hips, cat's pajamas theme. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he did use the cat's pajamas in his comics. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's where a lot of people first heard the phrase. But as far as actually inventing it, I'm not sold. For one thing, in the many obituaries that were printed when he passed away, the tons of slang Tad is said to have invented are listed. And in everywhere I looked other than Werner's article, the cat's pajamas is not listed. The cat's pajamas when he passed away was still a very famous phrase. It was the name of a major motion picture released just 3 years before his death after all. If there was a hint that he invented the idiom, I feel like it would have been listed in more places. And then I started thinking about my experience of reading Tad's comics from the archive, and how on a couple of them where he'd used slang which has fallen out of fashion, so much so that I'd never heard of it, my experience reading those comics was just confusion, not really entertainment. And if we're to believe Tad was inventing all these slang terms rather than just using slang he'd heard, then that would have been the same experience readers in the 20s would have had. Perhaps this is just my modern eyes looking at this and not understanding something from the past, but to me, it makes infinitely more sense that people would enjoy the use of slang in Tad's comics because he was using colloquialisms they recognised. Perhaps that's not compelling enough to you, and if that's the case, I can see your perspective on that. But personally, this is the point where I decided to remove Tad as a suspect in the case. And I'm glad I did, because as you'll see, there's a lot more left to this story. When researching Tad, I found that for health reasons, he sadly was practically a shut-in for the last decade of his life. And so I started to wonder if he didn't invent some of the slang and he wasn't hearing it in person because he rarely left the house. Perhaps he was getting it from the media he was consuming while at home. Maybe from other newspapers. So I searched the newspaper archive, and what do you know? I found this article with a glossary of modern, for the 1920s that is, slang. Here are the type of words you'd find in Tad's work, including a definition of the cat's pajamas from the South Bend News-Times newspaper, April 28th, 1922. All under the heading of the Flapper's Dictionary. And that brought me to suspect number 3, the flapper. Can I be honest with you? I kind of only knew flapper girls as women in the 20s who had short hair, wore cool dresses, and danced while saying things like 23 Skidoo. Oh, Tad apparently invented that slang too, but we don't have time for that. Back to flappers. But yeah, that was the sort of extent of my knowledge on the flapper. So I was quite fascinated to find out when I started investigating how much more there was to this movement. The flapper first appeared in Europe in the early 1900s, before eventually getting imported into America in the late teens. There were a lot of different aspects that went into the flapper aesthetic and lifestyle, but it could all sort of be characterised as a rejection of the traditional styles and roles of women of the past. The corsets and long dresses were replaced with easier to dance in outfits with shorter skirts. Long hair was chopped short, smoking, drinking, partying, and even premarital sex, things that would have been thought of as unladylike to previous generations, were engaged with aplomb. This 1917 American news article from around the time the flapper was making her trip across the Atlantic somewhat scathingly tries to define her. It writes, "The flapper originated in English society a dozen years ago. She's just becoming known in this country, mainly as having given a smart name to certain fashions for girls. In her native land, the flapper is an honest, talkative, critical, and very active girl, 15 or 16 years old. She has no respect whatsoever for her brother's opinions, and she makes fun of his friends or quarrels with them, and she is not the least sentimental outwardly." And it goes on. "Her indifference to the opposite sex makes her most irritating to all young gentlemen. She's a good sportswoman. She goes in for game and not for the clothes, and often she can beat a male opponent. She takes honours in school too. She is more nearly the equal of the male than at any other age, and she is very apt to let him know it. This little trait does not add to her popularity with the boys, but it does give them a good excuse for ridiculing the flapper. And we can see in this newspaper article, the writer wrote this definition almost like these things were negative. But to many women at the time, this definition sounded great. More freedom and equality, what's so bad about that? And to put it into their own words, what one society of flappers put as their core planks that needed to be protected in 1922 were the following: bobbed hair, rolled socks, independence, smoking in public, no shifter language, no leaning vine tactics, snuggle parties if desired, liberalism combined with propriety, clothes worn in conformity with individual taste. And now, think of the time this was taking place. The First World War was just finishing, where so many had just died. And then you'd also just had the pandemic of the Spanish flu, which again killed so many. This was a time when it was becoming all too clear that life was fleeting. It could be taken away at any moment. So why waste it being unhappy or subservient? If you wanted to go out, be young, cut your hair short, wear what you wanted and do what you wanted, if you weren't hurting anyone, why not do it? And not to mention the prohibition going on, which helped create the underground speakeasies flappers might frequent. It was a time when fun was found by breaking the rules, in all senses. As 1920 hit, the year in which women won the vote in America, the flapper look and mentality had taken over the zeitgeist. She was in fashion magazines and newspaper articles. People furrowed their brows about what to do with this wayward generation who were getting entirely too jazzy. Take a look at this really bizarre poem I found, where the author goes on about how much he'd love to slap the flapper, which sort of exemplifies this. But others at the time just embraced this new movement. The 1920 film The Flapper, starring Olive Thomas, helped cement her rise to the top. Many flappers became movie stars, it girls like Clara Bow and Joan Crawford. On Crawford, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, "Joan Crawford is doubtless the best example of the flapper. The girl you see in smart nightclubs, gowned to the apex of sophistication, toying iced glasses with a remote, faintly bitter expression, dancing deliciously, laughing a great deal, with wide, hurt eyes, young things with a talent for living." So you might ask, what does any of this have to do with our investigation? Well, there was another aspect to the flapper lifestyle that I have yet to mention. Slang. Yep, the flapper, in her rejection of the past, also rejoiced in discarding the phrases of yesterday, and revelled in using a new language that only she and her friends understood. It's weird because you might think the biggest complaint of the starched-shirted older generation at the time would be the flappers' eschewing of traditional gender roles. And whilst that is there, if you look at newspapers at the time, what comes up over and over again is the very specific hatred of flappers' slang. So in their attempt to understand and sometimes mock the flapper, many papers write a glossary of their terms, and we see over and over again that the cat's pajamas is a term that apparently belongs to the flappers. But of course, this still doesn't exactly help our investigation. We still don't really know if there's a reason why this particular phrase is what was being used. But at this point, I came across something interesting. This 1922 gossip column, written by a lady named Nancy Wynne. She writes about talking to a young flapper and documents her general confusion at the strange slang the young flapper uses. Quote, "I suppose my lot falls in various pastures at various times. What I mean is, I will go for weeks without seeing some of my own intimate friends, and I meet no one but débutantes, or girls of a second and third year. While on the other hand, I won't happen to talk with a younger girl for a long time. Recently, however, the younger set has predominated, and I am fairly overcome with the latest in conversation. Said I to a certain debutante last year, 'Isn't Mary T pretty?' 'Sure,' said my friend. 'She's the cat's cuffs.' And on further inquiry, I found out that Jack R was a wonder. 'Why, my dear, he's a regular snake's hips.' And so it went on. Such expressions as the cat's pajamas, the elephant's adenoids, the pussy's meow, and ever so many others. If they meant something, would you say anything? But at the same time, it's wonderful to be as silly as that. Just to see the mystified look on my face must have given that small person unqualified joy. And after all, a cat's cuffs would be awfully fresh and sweet, because nice little cats always keep their small paws clean and white. It's really great to be crazy, is it not? And that kind of put something into perspective for me. The point was that it didn't make sense. It's a rebellion put into words, an in-joke for a younger generation, whose sole purpose is to allow you to laugh at the older generation's annoyed puzzlement at the term. Oh my god, the cat's pajamas is brain rot. It's shitposting. Is that bloody deep-fried meme of Markiplier's face photoshopped onto Lord Farquaad with the letter E on it? It's not supposed to make sense. It's just some nonsensical combination of words you say so that you can laugh at the older generation who doesn't understand it. It's just a meme. So there I was, the case blown wide open. I'd gone looking to find a cat in pajamas, but the whole point was there wasn't one. That's the whole joke. I just wasn't hip enough to their slang to know that. But wait a second, hip? That makes me think of something. Isn't hepcat a bit of slang? Why, yes it is. We see it defined in band leader Cab Calloway's 1938 Jive Dictionary, Cab Calloway's cat-a-log. And it's defined as a guy who knows all the answers, understands jive. And cat is simply defined as a musician in a swing band. So why is that important? Well, look at the Cotton Club in Harlem, the club that Calloway was the band leader in, and before him Duke Ellington was the band leader there. It opened in 1923 and is often said to have had a strict whites-only policy, but as Malcolm Womack writes in his paper Harlem Holiday, The Cotton Club, 1925 to 1940, strictly the Cotton Club didn't refuse to admit African Americans. Its policies of racial inclusion and exclusion were far more fluid, and the steep prices of the venue tended to do more work than the doorman to discourage most residents of Harlem from attending the club. But either way, the audiences were mostly well-to-do whites, while the vast majority of performers were African American. This environment sets up a strange scenario where the white audiences were being introduced into a portion of African American culture in Harlem, the music, the dances, the slang, but in a way that was almost like a tourist visiting Disneyland and believing they had truly visited a magical kingdom. For more context on this, I cannot recommend enough reading the paper I mentioned a moment ago, Harlem Holiday, The Cotton Club, 1925 to 1940 by Malcolm Womack, which I've linked to in the description of this video. I stumbled across it online and found it totally engrossing. It's a really interesting dive into the history of the Cotton Club, which I thought I knew a little about, but turns out I really didn't. And it focuses on the idea of how white patrons attending the club, or slumming it in Harlem as they would call it, was a form of cultural tourism. As Womack writes, ideas of tourism seem obvious in writing about the predominantly white audiences at the Cotton Club, people who literally travel to the unfamiliar neighborhood of Harlem to watch African Americans perform their blackness in song, music and body. The tourists at the Cotton Club were in the hottest room in the most vibrant neighborhood of America's cultural capital, and they were exploring gymnastic performances and cutting-edge music, and also exploring their imperfect and frequently unpleasant understandings of race. The term safari was used often by writers both white and black, then and now, to describe the experience. It's certainly worth shining our investigative light towards jive talk, the African American vernacular that was a huge part of the 1920s jazz scene, when trying to figure out the origin of our bit of 1920s slang. Because a lot of the slang and cultural hallmarks of this time in general were first found in smoky, jazz-filled rooms like the Cotton Club. As Womack writes, the 1920s were a time where affluent whites became increasingly fascinated with what had previously been forbidden: criminal culture, jazz culture, black culture, the jazz age creation of what scholar Ann Douglas calls mongrel Manhattan, the unprecedented mix of racial cultures, informs an understanding of the Cotton Club. Douglas writes, if this was, as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the jazz age, the age was black. And Womack goes on to write, these attitudes position jazz and urban black culture as part of an aggressively American youth movement. Like the vast majority of youth movements in popular culture, it was largely seen as low culture, and its proponents came to embrace it as such. Listening to jazz music on phonographs and the radio was one thing, but travelling to a nightclub to listen to the music in person was seen as a statement of affiliation with the music and the lifestyle, a youthful American rejection of older European artistic standards. A trip to Harlem wasn't only a libidinous exercise, an opportunity to enjoy a multitude of sins in a compartmentalized moral or immoral space. By listening to Ellington's creation of a modern oral territory in the Cotton Club, a complicated white constructed space in a black neighborhood, the white tourists were rejecting European standards of art and morality and asserting a unique, difficult, raucous Americanness. In the literal sense, as we see in the books like Calloway's Glossary of Jive Terms, he taught the socialites attending his club how to sound cool when you spoke, and that was by copying him. And all this leads us to a particular point. You see, as mentioned, jazz artists of the time were using the word cat in a positive way to mean themselves, and flappers of the time were going to these jazz clubs and listening to this jazz music. So perhaps it's not a stretch to say that it was in these spaces that the flapper learned that it was cool to be a cat. And that's important because traditionally, cat was a negative bit of slang for a woman. It meant a lewd woman or a prostitute. That's where the phrase cat house, meaning a brothel, is derived from. But something interesting starts happening in the late 1910s. Women seemingly take it back. We can see this in Tad's comic where these women refer to themselves as cats, not in a negative way. And we can read in this 1919 Omaha Daily Bee article where the female author Gabby laments, quote, "The only confusing part of it is that we girls will never know whether we are being slurred or complimented when we are referred to as cats." I can imagine a world where, in the rebellion so associated with being a flapper, when flappers heard jazz musicians referring to themselves as cats, in a positive way, they thought, perhaps why not them too? Now, if you tie this in with another fact, something interesting occurs, because it turns out, as the 1900s kicked in, a type of woman started to emerge, the so-called pajama girl. At the turn of the century, you start seeing newspaper articles like this one in the San Francisco Call, June 29th, 1902, that excitedly declare that pajamas were no longer only for men. Move over, boys, women have come for your nightwear. And yeah, over the next few years, pajamas suddenly start to become a more exotic and exciting thing for girls to wear in the evening, and their popularity caused pajama makers to vary the cuts and the fabric that were used, culminating in silkier, slightly more tailored sleepwear. I think this page I found in the December 19 edition of the magazine Motion Picture Classic really helps epitomise the feeling of what pajamas meant at this time. It shows actress Constance Talmadge in various different nightwear-clad scenes, and I think this phrasing, where it describes her as wearing everything from aristocratic silken pajamas to democratic cotton nightie, is quite telling. Note how it also breathlessly mentions this raunchy moment in her film Up the Road with Sally, where the sheerness in Constance's silk pajamas causes more of her figure to be seen when she's holding a candle. All of this is to say, wearing pajamas as a woman by the 1910s was associated with both having money and also being ever so slightly saucy. So you see, before a flapper was a flapper, she was likely to be a pajama girl. And even after she would have identified herself as a flapper, she was still likely to wear really nice pajamas to bed. And as mentioned, she'd also likely refer to herself as a cat. So if you're picking up what I'm putting down here, perhaps the term cat's pajamas wasn't as meaningless as I first thought. This idea is slightly bolstered by an article I found from 1926 in American Speech, the same paper that in 1929 would print that Tad invented the phrase. But here, 3 years before that, in 1926, when talking about the origin of the phrase, it writes, "Some time ago, we were wont to indicate our approval of somebody or something with, 'she's a bear.' Later this became, 'she's the berries,' and still later, she became the cats." These brief phrases, however, failed to satisfy because of their obvious limitations, and various modifications came into being. The domestic feline was the first to do duty, but laterally no living creature has been exempted. The elephant, the bee, the rhinoceros, and the saurians figure largely. Sundry, far-fetched, and impossible attributes are assigned the task of making the current colloquialisms more picturesque. Thus we find cat's whiskers, eel's hips, snake's toenails. Alliteration is found in the cat's cradle, elephant's eyebrows, and pussy's pajamas. Rhyme occurs, for instance, in the bee's knees. And it's true. I went looking and I can find "she's a bear" as a positive bit of slang printed earlier than the cat's pajamas. And I also see the berries defined as a synonym for the bee's knees in this glossary. So those bits both check out. And so it's interesting to note that the author here points out that apparently the cat is the first animal to be found in the nonsense phrase slang. As he says, the domestic feline was the first to do the duty. According to him, the cat's cuffs and cat's pajamas came first, and those are what set off the slightly brain rot trend of just listing an animal and then saying a random item it doesn't have. But he doesn't mention why the cat and its pajamas came first. Here's just an unsubstantiated guess from me, the type that wouldn't hold up in court. But maybe, just maybe, it's because the first bit of slang was never nonsense. It was a fun in-joke that most people didn't get. You see, whilst a gnat is unlikely to have an overcoat, if we know that women were calling themselves cats, then it's not so crazy to think that a cat can have pajamas. I guess unless we unearth some more evidence, we'll never know for sure. I did uncover some other strange leads in my investigation. For example, the Cats and Jammer Kids was a very popular early 1900s comic, and to be a jammer was also a bit of slang from the early 1900s. It meant something good, like a movie was so good it jammed the place, it filled it. And then I found the phrase Katz and Jammers in a 1940 newspaper. So I don't know, it's a jammer, Katz and Jammer, Katz and Jammers, Katz Pajamas? Is that anything? Probably not. And I also found these 1905 photos taken by the Rotograph company, featuring cats wearing pajamas. And whilst cute, I don't think that's probably related. And then I found this store called Katz in Hot Springs, Arkansas, that in 1915 I found advertising its quality pajamas. But again, I'm going to go with this just being a coincidence. To me, though we may not be able to fully prove it, I think the inventor of our phrase was likely suspect 3, the flapper. The fact the phrase is fun, irreverent, and purposefully playfully weird certainly fits her profile. Speaking on the flapper again, just to close that loop, the flapper movement seemed to die with the Great Depression in 1929. The opulence and carefree attitude just didn't seem to jive with how the world was after the market crashed. Then of course World War II started shortly after that, and I haven't seen it written anywhere, but personally I wonder if the Hays Code, which came in 1930, might have also had an impact. It banned movies showing the quote-unquote licentious behaviour that might have been associated with the flapper lifestyle. And cinema, of course, especially then, helped shape the culture. That's why the Hays Code was brought in, after all. Whatever the exact reason, by the 1930s, the flappers had 23 skidooed. And as I think on the death of the flapper, I do feel a genuine sadness. Perhaps it's because I feel a sort of connection to them. As I sit here in the 20s, the 2020s, but the 20s no less, just after a global pandemic that killed so many, in a world that feels so precarious, militarily speaking, with what looks like it might be a great recession on the horizon, I feel like, just a little, I get the flapper mentality. Maybe it's not a coincidence that their slang and our slang seems so purposefully stupid and nonsensical, because both 100 years ago and now, we're feeling like life's short and unpredictable. And at the moment, younger generations don't seem to have that strong a say on what's happening. So if nothing else, for the time being, we can at least have some fun in perplexing an older generation with our incomprehensible slang. So let's close the... Wait a minute. Yeah, I was just rereading Malcolm Womack's paper as I was finishing up the script, and something stood out to me in this read-through. This innocuous detail where he mentions Oney Madden, the gangster who owned the Cotton Club. Apparently, when he sold it in 1935, he retired to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Where have I heard that name before? Right, that 1915 Pajamas ad by a shop named Katz. That shop was in Hot Springs. But yeah, as I mentioned, I didn't really think there was much to that connection. Just seems like a coincidence. But a lot of that assumption was based on me just thinking Hot Springs was just a random little town. What does it matter if some podunk place happened to have a shop in it named Katz that sold pajamas? Why is that important if no one who was shaping the culture at the time would know about it? But this mention of Oney moving there was enough for me to reassess my biases. And what do you know, I couldn't have been more wrong. And apologies to any residents of Hot Springs. I was unfamiliar with your game, because in the early 20th century, Hot Springs was a playground for the wealthy. With its luxury spas and venues to socialise and party and gamble, it attracted the elite of the day. After his first visit in 1915, Babe Ruth got hooked on the place. To quote the Society of American Baseball Research, Babe was immediately smitten with Hot Springs, then regarded as the mecca of professional baseball players. It was the most exotic place he had ever seen. The warm baths, mountain vistas, golf courses, racehorses, and attractive women seemed like a dream. A tiny bit later, at the beginning of the 20s, Al Capone and various other famous gangsters started visiting. To quote the Mob Museum, long before Las Vegas became the underworld's casino playground, Hot Springs, Arkansas was home away from home for the most notorious names in US organized crime. Al Capone, Albert Anastasia, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Carlos Marcello, these and many more vacationed in the Spa City, where illegal but open prostitution and gambling attracted mob royalty for decades until the casinos were shut down in the late 1960s. And then, of course, came the jazz musicians. As written on the hotsprings.org website, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Cab Calloway all performed in the historic Woodmen of the Union Building, a hotel, bathhouse, and performance venue that catered to African American visitors during the days of segregation. And Bessie Smith, regarded by many as the greatest blues singer of all time, was inspired by a visit to Hot Springs to write and record the Hot Springs Blues in 1927. So pardon my ignorance, because Podunk Town this place was not. And so with that in mind, let's have another look at this clothes shop. We can read that it was opened seemingly in 1912 by German immigrant and veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, Arthur H. Katz. It was first named Sadler's, but then quickly renamed to the eponymous Katz. And when Arthur H. Katz passed away in January 1915, the clothing store was already doing, quote, splendid trade. It was taken over by his sons, Arthur and Felix. And far from being just another clothes shop, it does seem like quite an important one in the area. We can read this list of what appears to be paid-up members of an association of Arkansas clothes shops in a 1920 newspaper. And there appear to be only a few companies in Hot Springs that fit that description, one of which being the Katz Company. On this same newspaper page, we see Felix Katz seems to be being nominated for some position in this association, and either he or Arthur Katz is vouching for someone in an earlier article, proving their word had some cachet. And in this other newspaper article, we see that Arthur Katz Sr. in 1915 is chairman of the Merchants Committee in Hot Springs. And in another article, we see Arthur Jr. even managed in 1917 to bring the National Association of Retail Clothers to Hot Springs for a meeting. In various articles, we see the Katz Company is doing well enough that it was one of the companies helping to pay for adverts for Liberty Bonds. And this article from 1914 states that Katz is the sole agent in Hot Springs to sell genuine Borsellino hats from Italy. This luxurious hat that became the hallmark of the Italian mafioso. If you wanted one of these in Hot Springs, you had to go to Katz. Now, feel free to disagree, but to me, the Katz family and their clothing store seem like sort of a big deal in this important city at this time. And this store, in 1916, was taking out adverts for their fine pajamas. And keep in mind, the first printed example we have of the phrase the Katz pajamas is from 1919. So this is from 3 years before that. And note, it's not a list of all their different products, it's an advert just for their pajamas. Pajamas so good that apparently they'd make a perfect Christmas present. And this shop apparently sold such fine silk pajamas that they could run you up to $10 for a pair, which is around $300 in today's money. Am I crazy here, or does it not seem that far-fetched that the pajamas sold by Katz in the 1910s might have been of such high quality that the various well-to-do trend makers who vacationed in Hot Springs, Arkansas, might have originated our feline phrase? You see, I laughed when I heard the story of E.B. Katz, the tailor, making pajamas for a king. But perhaps, like so much other folklore, the story just got a bit mangled. Maybe we're looking at a bit of American mythology based on a real happening, where Katz the tailor lived in Arkansas, not England, and the people he furnished in pajamas were luminaries instead of kings. Hollywood royalty, not royalty. The social elites of the early 20th century, the baseball players, the gangsters, the jazz musicians. Maybe before the flapper reinterpreted the slang, it was even more literal than any of us ever imagined. It might be impossible to know for sure, but if that was the case, man, wouldn't that be the Katz pajamas? Thank you very much for watching this video. Please do like, hype, comment, subscribe. Any way you can interact with this video would really help. Huge shout out to you, DBet, for becoming a member. It really does help me making videos like this. If you'd like to become a member like them, you can do too. But for now, that's everything I got for you today. Bye, folks.